Muy buenas tardes, estimados miembros de la mesa principal, doctora Cindy Fernández, directora de la Escuela de Biología, máster Pascal Giró, director de la Escuela de Geografía de la Universidad de Costa Rica, máster Úrsula Parrilla, directora regional de la Oficina Regional de la UICN para México, América Central y el Caribe, doctor Thomas Brooks, científico principal de la UICN, miembros de UICN en Costa Rica, miembros de las comisiones de la UICN en Costa Rica, estimados docentes y estudiantes de la Universidad de Costa Rica que nos acompañan esta tarde, colegas de la Oficina Regional de UICN. En nombre de nuestra Oficina Regional para México, América Central y el Caribe de la Unión Internacional para la Conservación de la Naturaleza, queremos darles la más cordial bienvenida y agradecer a la Universidad de Costa Rica, en especial a la Escuela de Biología y a la Escuela de Geografía por recibirnos esta tarde. La Unión Internacional para la Conservación de la Naturaleza, la UICN, es una unión de miembros única, formada por organizaciones gubernamentales y de la sociedad civil más antigua a nivel global. Es la autoridad mundial en cuanto al estado del mundo natural y las medidas necesarias para salvaguardarlo. En el marco de los 35 años de presencia activa de la UICN en esta región, más de 7 décadas han marcado la ruta de la agenda ambiental global con el concurso de sus más de 1,400 miembros alrededor del mundo, más de 15,000 expertos de comisiones y cooperantes, enlazados en lo que es la unión de voluntades conservacionistas más grande del mundo. En ese marco, la ciencia desempeña un papel fundamental en la protección y preservación de nuestros ecosistemas y especies. Y este evento con el que concluimos la Semana de la Ciencia en UICN Ormac, nos complace mucho estar con ustedes esta tarde para compartir conocimiento fundamental para los esfuerzos de protección y preservación de nuestros ecosistemas y especies y explorar asimismo cómo la ciencia puede brindar soluciones innovadoras y sostenibles para los desafíos actuales y futuros en materia de conservación. A continuación, y para dar inicio a esta actividad, escucharemos las palabras de la doctora Cindy Fernández, directora de la Escuela de Biología.
Muy buenas tardes, muchas gracias. Para mí es un placer tenerlos acá, muchísimas gracias. Una bienvenida al doctor Brooks, a doña Úrsula Parrilla, directora general de la UICN para México y América Central y el Caribe, y al director de la Escuela de Geografía, don Pascal, que en conjunto con la Escuela de Biología organizamos esta actividad. Para nosotros es un placer tener una charla alrededor de un tema tan importante como lo es cómo funciona realmente la conservación. Esto es una pregunta apasionante, una pregunta englobadora, una pregunta gigantesca. Y es una pregunta crucial para el mundo actual donde vivimos, donde enfrentamos desafíos ambientales sin precedentes. La conservación de nuestra naturaleza y los recursos naturales se ha convertido en una necesidad apremiante en vista de la pérdida de biodiversidad, el cambio climático y otros temas ambientales que nos afectan a nuestro planeta. Aunado a esto, las comunidades necesitan alternativas sostenibles para poder mantener a sus familias. La comunidad científica debe tratar de buscar respuestas para mejorar la conservación y el manejo integrado de nuestros recursos. Y los gobernantes deben tomar las decisiones balanceadas basadas en ciencias para poder generar un manejo correcto y una gestión correcta de los recursos. En nuestra búsqueda de respuestas debemos recordar que la conservación es un trabajo en equipo. No solo se trata de esfuerzos individuales de algunos apasionados defensores del medio ambiente, sino la responsabilidad compartida de todos nosotros, comunidades, científicos, gobiernos. Es un llamado de atención colectiva para preservar nuestra herencia natural y garantizar un futuro sostenible para las generaciones futuras. Espero que esta charla nos inspire a motivar a todos los participantes activamente en la conservación, ya sea a través de pequeñas acciones diarias que todos podemos hacer o iniciativas a gran escala. Cada uno de nosotros puede marcar la diferencia en contribuir al bienestar de nuestro planeta. Y una vez más, quiero agradecer a todas las personas que están aquí presentes y especialmente a Thomas Brook, que nos acompaña el día de hoy. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doña Cindy. Seguidamente vamos a escuchar al máster Pascal Giraud, director de la Escuela de Geografía.
Muy buenas tardes a la doctora Úrsula Parrilla y al doctor Thomas Brook de la UICN, a la doctora Cindy Fernández de la Escuela de Biología. Agradezco muchísimo también a la Escuela de Biología haber aceptado recibir y organizar esta conferencia del día de hoy y que hayamos podido juntar esfuerzos entre ambas escuelas aquí en la Universidad de Costa Rica, desde la Escuela de Geografía y la Escuela de Biología. Creo que no es casualidad de que estos dos temas se unen en un tema tan importante como lo es la conservación de la biodiversidad y el futuro de la biodiversidad del planeta. Creo que es una preocupación que abordamos desde diferentes perspectivas, con diferentes herramientas, y creo que hoy en día nos confrontamos al mismo reto, el reto de cómo realmente medir si está funcionando o no, y me pareció muy provocativo el título de la conferencia del doctor Brooks. Me parece efectivamente que tenemos que hacernos estas preguntas incómodas. En la región mesoamericana llevamos más de 50 años aplicando enfoques de planificación biorregional en toda la región, pero también nos enfrentamos a enormes problemas para poder sostener los modelos de conservación in situ que hemos construido a lo largo de los últimos 30 o 40 años en la región centroamericana. A mí me complace en lo personal muchísimo tener esta actividad conjuntamente con la UICN, ya que tuve el honor de trabajar también con la Oficina Regional para Mesoamérica y el Caribe hace unos cuantos lustros, y que la verdad sigo convencido de que la única forma que vamos a poder realmente enfrentar y abordar y ojalá resolver esta crisis de extinción planetaria, ese espasmo de extinción que vivimos hoy en día, es a través de esta unión única entre la academia, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y los gobiernos. Y creo que ojalá podamos aprovechar esta conferencia del doctor Brooks para justamente saber cómo estamos en cuanto al estado de la conservación de la biodiversidad a nivel mundial, pero cómo podemos en una región tan rica como la mesoamericana, cómo podemos actuar para poder enfrentar esta crisis de extinción que tenemos en ciernes. Así que muchísimas gracias y muy buenas tardes.
Muchas gracias. Seguidamente damos ahora la palabra a la máster Úrsula Parrilla, directora regional de la UICN para México, América Central y el Caribe, para introducir también al doctor Brooks. Gracias, Úrsula.
Gracias, Ana. Y muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Doctora Cindy Fernández, directora de la Escuela de Biología, y el doctor Pascal Giraud de la Escuela de Geografía de la Universidad de Costa Rica por hacer realidad esta charla, ¿verdad? Que llevábamos ya algunas semanas planificando, aprovechando la visita del doctor Thomas Brook, científico principal de la UICN a Costa Rica, en lo que hemos llamado la Semana de la Ciencia. Un poco de la UICN, ya Ana nos comentó un poco qué es la UICN, pero me gustaría estresar el hecho de que la unión, porque es una unión, ¿verdad?, de miembros, pero ¿qué tipo de miembros? Somos 1,400 miembros que representan a los gobiernos soberanos, gobiernos subnacionales, pueblos indígenas y sociedad civil. Esto hace a la unión una especie de organización muy única, con una voz muy especial en el Concierto de las Naciones y en los debates sobre desarrollo sostenible que se sostienen. Tenemos otro pilar muy importante que son las comisiones de la UICN, y bienvenidos a todos los miembros de las comisiones que hoy nos acompañan. Son esos 15,000 científicos que donan su tiempo, es tiempo ad honorem, que son parte de las 7 comisiones que conforman ese pilar tan importante. Ustedes habrán escuchado de la lista roja de especies amenazadas de la UICN. Ese es un producto de una de las comisiones. La categorización de áreas protegidas que rige, que dicta un poco cómo organizamos y manejamos las áreas protegidas, también es un producto de las comisiones. No quisiera repetir la importancia, ¿verdad?, de poder hablar sobre la ciencia, la conservación y su contribución a los retos que enfrentamos en términos de desarrollo sostenible, pero poner un poco en perspectiva estas cifras, justo las comentaba hoy en otro foro. ¿Por qué es tan importante en este contexto post-pandemia? Se habla mucho de la recuperación económica, esta crisis que han sufrido especialmente en nuestra región. Los datos de la CEPAL indican que para finales del 2020, o sea, esto ya son cifras de hace un par de años, el número de gente por debajo de la línea de pobreza en América Latina creció a 209 millones, 20 millones más que en el 2019. Esto confrontado con otra crisis, la crisis de biodiversidad, la crisis de cambio climático. Casi 4,000 especies en Mesoamérica están catalogadas bajo un riesgo elevado de extinción. Eso solo las especies que hemos podido documentar. Ante este tipo de desafíos, ¿no?, tan interconectados, uno se pregunta, si uno es un político, un presidente, ¿cuál priorizas primero? ¿El tema de la pobreza, que está ahí muy visible, o el tema de la conservación, que a veces es tan difícil trasladar esos datos hacia los decisores, los tomadores de decisión y los políticos? Y la Unión tiene, y la gran comunidad de conservación a la cual todos ustedes pertenecen, tenemos el gran imperativo moral de hacer estos datos claros, ¿verdad? Y que le hablen también a esa sección de nuestros políticos y tomadores de decisión, que al final son los que deciden a dónde van las inversiones, ¿verdad? Y cómo esa recuperación se va a dar, si va a ser considerando o no temas de sostenibilidad ambiental, temas de capital natural y el tema de la pérdida de biodiversidad. Es por ello que para mí el involucramiento de las nuevas generaciones de científicos de todas las disciplinas, geografía, biología, ecología, sociología, es muy importante para encontrar estas soluciones a estos desafíos que no pueden ser abordados desde una sola disciplina. Y deben ser construidas en la base de evidencia sólida y rigurosa, ¿verdad?, científica. Es por esto que para mí es un gran honor tener aquí al doctor Thomas Brooks, científico principal de la UICN, a quien le doy la bienvenida y lo invito a tomar el podio, y creo que nosotros. Muchísimas gracias y espero disfruten la charla.
Doesn't work this way. Very good indeed. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for this magnificent invitation to speak here in University of Costa Rica today. This is very much a homecoming for me, being invited to speak jointly by the School of Biology and School of Geography. My first degree is in geography, my PhD in ecology, so I feel very much at home here speaking with you today. As my very kind introductions, Ursula, Cindy, Pascal, I'm going to address a question today of fundamental relevance to our union, UICN, to all of conservation, and indeed, I would argue, to the whole world. Does conservation work? I'm going to be talking about a number of global themes, of systematic analyses and reviews that look around our entire planet. But conservation is fundamentally local. And so I'll also be illustrating the points that I'll be making through our talk this afternoon with the story of a particular species in a particular place, a particular habitat, and the people who've been involved in the conservation of that species over the years. The particular species that I'm going to focus on for the detailed part of my talk is this Cebu four-colored flower pecker. Cebu four-colored flower pecker, a species of passerine bird that lives only in the forest canopy of a small amount of forest on a small island in a small country, the Philippines, only found on the island of Cebu in the central Philippines. This map shows the area where it was first discovered about 125 years ago in central Cebu. And in 1936, that area, outlined in red on the map here, was established as a national park, Central Cebu National Park. So a conservation action in place 90 years ago already. All was not well, however. In 1959, so 25 years after the establishment of that national park, the great Diaz-Rabor, the father of ornithology in the Philippines, wrote a fundamentally important paper based on his long-term field work on the island of Cebu, arguing, bringing evidence from his field data to show that as a result of the almost complete deforestation of the island of Cebu, that the Cebu flower pecker and 9 of the 10 other bird taxa only found on the island had now become extinct. So a global bird extinction from a national park. This isn't a very auspicious, this isn't a very optimistic beginning to a talk about whether conservation works. let me bring some more uplifting news. Let us bring us all the way up to date, all the way to December last year. The world is waking up to the crisis of the loss of biodiversity. Last year, last December, the world's governments agreed to a comprehensive new global biodiversity framework, a specific plan to safeguard life on Earth. The Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adds specificity, adds particular accountability for actions towards overall conservation outcomes within the broader context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which of course brought for the very first time in history concerns of environmental sustainability to the same level as concerns of social and economic sustainability. So we have grand global plans for looking after the life with which we share our planet. But some are still rather skeptical as to whether these grand global commitments and goals are indeed backed up by sufficient action to safeguard life on our planet. This cartoon from the great Danish cartoonists Wolf and Morgenthaler introduces a note of skepticism regarding the efficacy of global conservation commitments. And indeed, if we look at the evidence, there are clearly some challenges in the world's government's efforts to meet global environmental goals. This is an evaluation published a couple of years ago by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, assessing progress towards the ACHI targets, the strategic plan for biodiversity agreed under the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010. The green traffic light scores there illustrate those targets which were considered to have been successfully achieved. The yellow indicate those where there was mixed progress, and the red indicates those which were not achieved, where global biodiversity targets failed over the last decade. And you can see there indeed, as Wolf Morgenthaler predicted, that there's a lot of red there and not very much green. What we're going to do through this afternoon is to dig into a couple of those themes, in particular the themes which were embodied, which were captured in ACHI targets 11 about protected areas and 12 about species conservation, about stopping species from becoming extinct and supporting species recovery. How do we know? How can we assess progress in conservation? How can we assess progress towards environmental goals? I'm going to introduce several key tools which help us, help conservation, help the world, both to plan for the implementation of such goals and to evaluate progress towards their delivery. The first of these, which I'll introduce, is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species is a tool for supporting the assessment of the risk of species extinction. It's organized through IUCN's Species Survival Commission. It's supported by a Red List partnership encompassing a dozen or so IUCN members and other institutions. It's been running now for more than 50 years and has assessed the extinction risk of more than 150,000 species around the world. However, over the last 20 years, 30 years perhaps, there have been three crucially important changes, innovations, which have been introduced into the Red List of threatened species, which are really important for helping to address our overall question, does conservation work? The first of these, introduced, for which the introduction came back in 1984, was the development of a standard approach to assessing extinction risk, a standard set of categories and criteria that mean that any given assessment of extinction risk can be compared, any given assessment of extinction risk can be compared, can be equivalent to another assessment for a different species, in a different taxonomic group, in a different place, by a different assessor, or over time. It introduces consistency, repeatability, and transparency into the Red List of threatened species, fundamental characteristics for a scientific assessment process. It's this consistency that can then allow tracking of progress by understanding whether changes over time are indeed genuine ones as a result of deteriorations in the state of the environment or improvements as a result of conservation. Building from that initial work in 1984, Georgina Mace and Russ Landy published a famous paper in 1991, establishing the basis for a set of categories and criteria for assessment of extinction risk. And then finally, in 2001, IUCN's Global Council, elected members from across the world's governments and from across civil society, approved the final set of categories and criteria, which have been persistent through to this day. Those categories and criteria agreed back 22 years ago now stand the test of time. So first major innovation, quantitative categories and criteria. The second major change was a shift in how assessments are carried out. A shift from focusing assessments a priori onto the assessment of species already considered to have a high risk of extinction, species for which particular people were particularly worried already, to instead assess the extinction risk of all species within given taxonomic groups, within particular taxonomic groups, that allow, again, an unbiased view into the state of nature across entire species groups. So all the way back to 1988, BirdLife International, a Red List partner and IUCN member, assessed the extinction risk of all of the world's bird species. And those assessments of bird species around the world have now been repeated 8 times over the last 25 years. More recently, 20 years ago now, the Species Survival Commission's amphibian specialist group, supported by other organizations, other Red List partners, Conservation International, NatureServe, and others assess the extinction risk of all of the world's amphibian species. More recently still, all of the world's mammal species assessed for extinction risk. Just last year, the extinction risk of all reptile species around the world was completed. At the moment, there are assessments well underway to be completed over the next year or two to assess all of the world's fish species in freshwater and in marine environments, to assess all of the world's tree species and a number of other groups. So increasingly broad sections of the diversity of life are comprehensively assessed to track progress towards conservation goals and to guide conservation action. The third major innovation for the Red List over the last couple of decades has been the incorporation of additional data into the Red List. At the heart of the Red List, those categories and criteria are the assessment of extinction risk. But going back now for 2 decades, it's also been required for a Red List assessment to incorporate information on geography, on the distribution of a given species, and to incorporate data on the threats which a given species faces, the habitats where it lives, the elevations at which it lives, or depths for marine species, information which now, while not part of the application of the categories and criteria, is fundamentally important for guiding conservation action on the basis of that information. That allows, for example, new work emerging over the last couple of years to put the Red List together to derive a metric, a species threat abatement and restoration metric that allows, on the basis of all of those data from across comprehensively assessed species groups, allows the derivation of a metric of the potential of particular actions in particular places to contribute towards the global goal as established in the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals, towards the global goal of reducing species extinction risk. That metric can be presented spatially. It's a spatial metric, but it can also be disaggregated according to the threats that species face, given the fact that data on threats is required in the Red List process, and therefore guide actions necessary to abate those threats. So what kind of things does the Red List of threatened species tell us? Looking across the 150,000 species assessed around the world to date, we find that about a third of species, or between a quarter and a third of species overall are threatened with a high risk of extinction. It's on the basis of that statistic that IPBES was able to derive for its global assessment an extrapolation, a prediction that overall, encompassing all undescribed species, perhaps about 1 million species around the world face a high risk of extinction. So returning to those species documented to face a high risk, we can zoom in to look at particular countries. Here looking specifically at Costa Rica, and looking at those categories, those Red List categories that document an elevated risk of extinction, we find that more than 1,200 species in Costa Rica are either threatened with extinction or close to being threatened, or else are data deficient, are species for which there are not sufficient information yet available to undertake an assessment of extinction risk. And that final point, data deficiency, is actually another really important one, and one that I'd like to highlight here. So you see in the bottom left there, 270 species here in Costa Rica, which are assessed on the red list as data deficient. And this is at one level, this is an important part of the scientific process of documenting uncertainty and documenting what we don't know as well as what we do know. But it's also a tremendously exciting opportunity for those of you maybe who are students here in biology or in geography, or who are looking for a project, maybe a master's project or so, the opportunity to make your mark towards solving a global problem. Go and find one of these species and work out what it is, what threats it faces, and indeed ultimately whether or not it is threatened with a high risk of extinction. So an enormous opportunity embedded in the red list, all the way to the level of individual universities, individual schools, individual students. Drawing back again, we can look at patterns of extinction risk, patterns of threat to the world species across different species groups. This was a figure again derived from the red list, incorporated into the 2019 IPBES global assessment, and shows two really important emerging features. The first is that there's a high level of variation in the prevalence of extinction risk between different species groups. The red and the orange and the yellow colors on the left, the hot colors, show those species facing a high risk of extinction. The green bars are species, proportions of species in different taxonomic groups facing a lower risk of extinction. And you can see there's enormous variation there, with some groups of species, bony fishes, birds, facing a fairly low risk of extinction in aggregate across all species around the world, whereas other groups, amphibians, conifers, cycad species, face a very high aggregate risk of extinction across all species around the world. One other important feature emerging from this graph is the gray bars, and the gray bars represent data deficiency. I talked about data deficiency in the particular case of Costa Rica a minute ago. And you can see, again, there's very wide variation between different species groups in the level of data deficiency. Some groups, for example, dragonflies or crustaceans or sharks and rays, have very high proportions of species and very large numbers of species for which we don't currently know what is happening to them. And so if you're looking for the opportunity to specialize, to focus on generating data towards helping to answer positively to the question, does conservation work, then those are the groups onto which to focus your attention. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago about the fact that all of the world's bird species have been assessed multiple times, have been assessed 8 times over the last 25 years. And those repeat assessments become really important in tracking progress towards global conservation goals. Specifically, what they enable is the derivation of a red list index that tells us about the genuine change over time of the aggregate risk of extinction of all species in particular taxonomic groups, or indeed all species which have been assessed across the board. This red list index is adopted by the United Nations as one of the indicators of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the new Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it's introduced as one of the what are called the headline indicators for the first goal of the framework. This figure is from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals report last year and shows the deterioration over the last 30 years in the Red List Index across different regions in the world. And you can see Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, there, the third row, intermediate levels of deterioration in the Red List Index over the last 30 years. You look at the bottom row, in total around the world over the last 3 decades, the Red List Index has deteriorated by about 10%. Again, this is not very encouraging news for the answer to our question, does conservation work? The Red List Index can also be on the basis of the geographic information embedded within the Red List. The Red List Index can also be mapped. It can be put on the map across countries or regions or ecosystem types. Here's a map of the Red List Index across countries with more deep purple colors indicating more rapid deteriorations and green colors indicating positive trends. A couple of points that emerge here. One is the strong deteriorations in the Red List Index in some of the world's largest economies, in, for example, the United States and China, Mexico and Australia, but also in smaller countries, including here in Costa Rica, some strong declines, strong deteriorations in the Red List Index over recent decades. But there are also some positive chinks of light in this map, in this diagram. I mentioned that green colors show improvements in the Red List Index over recent decades. And if you look carefully in the dotted lines for a number of small island states, you can see that countries which have actually been successful in turning around their Red List indices over recent decades, countries like Seychelles and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and like the Cook Islands and Fiji and Tonga in the Pacific Ocean, which as a result of actions to control alien invasive species and to establish protected areas, have been successful in reducing the extinction risk facing their species. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and move from talking about species to talk about places, to talk about protected areas and approaches to safeguarding important sites. Again, to introduce the data that are necessary to allow this kind of evaluation. Let me start by introducing the World Database on Protected Areas, or Protected Planet, which is jointly maintained by the United Nations Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Center and by IUCN, in particular, IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas. The World Database on Protected Areas is mandated under the United Nations as the UN list of protected areas, and it encompasses data now on more than 300,000 protected areas worldwide. Disculpe. I need to shout. I'm competing with the rain. Encompassing assessments of more than 300,000 protected areas, areas of land and water which have been designated for conservation management purposes under different kinds of governance, some under the governance of governments, some under the governance of indigenous people and local communities, or the private sector, or local governments. And in a similar way, to the standard for assessing extinction risk, which I described for species, IUCN maintains a standard guidance on the assessment of protected area management categories and protected area governance types, as well as the definition of a protected area overall. Let's have a look at Costa Rica. Let's zoom in to look at Costa Rica specifically. We can see that in the World Database on Protected Areas, Costa Rica documents 167 protected areas across your country, including 68 for which evaluations of management effectiveness have been completed and published. If we look at what protected area coverage looks like of land area and of the area of oceans around the world, this is a figure from the Protected Planet report from a couple of years ago, we can see that there have been consistent increases over recent decades in the extent of protected areas worldwide. Those increases look quite different between land and sea. For land, protected area coverage has increased incrementally over recent decades. While for the oceans, we had a long period through to about 2005 with relative stasis in terms of protected area coverage, not very much change, but then some really quite rapid growth in protected area coverage in the oceans over the last 15 years. This maybe tells us some good news for our question, does conservation work? Surely increases in the extent of protected areas are good news for does conservation work? And unfortunately, not necessarily. There are a number of reasons why measuring conservation success on the basis of the area, the hectares or the percentage of protected area, may not be a very good idea. This was an important paper published a couple of years ago by Megan Barnes and colleagues, and they showed no less than 12 reasons why using area as a measure of conservation success for protected areas is not very sensible. Most fundamentally, having a metric of area as a measure of protected area conservation success drives an incentive for establishing protected areas in places that are big and places that are cheap without consideration of the benefits of those protected areas to biodiversity. It doesn't measure the variables of interest. It doesn't measure what we are trying to achieve. And things can be even worse with a property called leakage. If the establishment of protected areas moves threats to biodiversity, for example, threats from unsustainable harvest of timber, unsustainable logging, or from agriculture, from places which are less important, then very often those threats can move, those economic activities can move to areas which are actually more important for biodiversity. And so measuring conservation success on the basis of the area, the hectares of protected areas, can be a very dangerous thing to do. Fortunately, there is an alternative, a widely available alternative, and a much more relevant alternative. And that is to measure the success of protected areas based on the degree to which they safeguard important places for biodiversity. So this introduces another data set. And again, it's another standard data set based on a global standard agreed through IUCN in 2016 for the identification of sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity, or key biodiversity areas. Key biodiversity areas have been identified now in all of the world's countries, about 16,000 key biodiversity areas identified around the world. They haven't yet been identified for many taxonomic groups and many ecosystems, and so there are still many key biodiversity areas yet to be identified, maybe in particular in freshwater and marine systems. But nevertheless, there is a large data set already available, produced at national levels, compiled globally, and then available for use across organizations that allows for the tracking of progress of protected areas in safeguarding places which are important for conservation. So here for Costa Rica, we can see a map of the overlay between protected areas and key biodiversity areas, with terrestrial protected areas shown in green, marine protected areas in dark blue, and key biodiversity areas in pink. Overall, there's a reasonable overlap. But if you look at the level of individual protected areas, it's not actually that strong of an overlap across Costa Rica. In aggregate across Costa Rica, protected area coverage of key biodiversity areas is an average of about 45%. So each of Costa Rica's key biodiversity areas is on average about half protected, half safeguarded by protected areas. So maybe glass half empty, glass half full. That's some good progress, but it also tells us there's quite a long way to go to safeguard important places for nature in Costa Rica. And that picture is one that's similar in nearly all countries around the world. Some good progress, some recent growth, but still quite a long way to go. And indeed, if you look actually at the global picture, it's actually almost worse than that. This is a plot. This is a plot looking at the question from the other direction and asking what proportion of all protected areas is represented by key biodiversity areas, or how important overall is the protected area estate. And what this shows for two globally comprehensive subsets of key biodiversity areas. IBAs are important bird areas identified by BirdLife International. AZEs are Alliance for Zero Extinction Sites, key biodiversity areas holding the entire global population of at least one highly threatened species. And if you look around the world over the last few decades, you find that there's been a decreasing proportion of protected areas which are important for biodiversity. We actually repeated that analysis just a couple of years ago, and that trend has continued. This was data through until about 2008. That trend has continued through till at least 2019. So what that tells us is that protected areas are being established disproportionately in places which are unimportant for biodiversity. Again, really not very good news for our question, does conservation work? So sorry to be bringing you a number of gloomy stories here. We've looked at the Red List Index showing deterioration across most of the world's countries over recent decades and across taxonomic groups. We've looked at protected area coverage and shown that while the number of hectares and the percentage of protected area coverage is going up, that's not necessarily focused into the right places for biodiversity. I'm afraid that halfway through my talk here, I'm not able to give a very positive answer to the question, does conservation work? To cheer you up a bit, let's return to the island of Cebu in the central Philippines. Now, over the decades from 1959, when Rebor published his paper showing that the birds of Cebu had been driven extinct through deforestation on the island, through until the 1990s, there was almost no conservation attention to the island of Cebu. The protected area, the Central Cebu National Park, stayed there. It retained there. It wasn't degazetted, but it received almost no conservation attention, management attention, governance attention. In the early 1990s, another Philippine ornithologist, a woman called Perla Magsalay, who was working on surveying the one surviving of Cebu's endemic birds, the Cebu black shammer. And she identified that there were some tiny little patches, just a few hectares of forest still surviving, first and foremost within Central Cebu National Park. I was lucky enough to work in the Philippines in the early 1990s with colleagues Guy Dutson and Rob Timmins. And Rob Timmins in 1992 decided that he was going to set off to look in these tiny patches of forest left in the mountains of Cebu, very rugged landscape, very hot, very steep, limestone karstic environment. He climbed up these mountains to these last tiny patches of forest, and there he was able to find the Cebu flowerpecker surviving after the last 4 decades of neglect, but surviving within the Central Cebu National Park. So maybe even though that Central Cebu National Park wasn't 100% successful, deforestation had been continuing, governance, management weren't ideal, but maybe it was still providing some level of conservation. Maybe it was still providing enough conservation that was allowing the persistence of the species for which it is so important at a global level as well as a national level. Let me step back from the specifics there to have a look at the general case, the general theory of measuring conservation impact, not just in absolute terms, but also relative to what would have happened in the absence of conservation. What would have happened if that Central Cebu National Park had not been established back in 1936? So here we've got a typical graph, a similar kind of graph to some of the ones we saw earlier of the Red List Index and of protected area coverage and so on, showing maybe a typical situation in conservation. We've got a baseline established, whenever that might have been, 2010. We've got time running along the x-axis to a point at which we're evaluating conservation impact. And we've had a policy that's been in place over that time. Let's say the establishment and management of a protected area, and an indicator, let's say an indicator of biodiversity, maybe the Red List Index, that's telling us about change in biodiversity. And we can see that despite having our conservation policy, there have been deteriorations. The trend has been a downward one. But it's really important to measure conservation impact, not just based on what has actually happened, but also based on what would have happened in the absence of a given conservation intervention. What would have happened in a scenario without a conservation intervention, a conservation policy? And that's called the counterfactual, the difference between what the difference between the baseline and what would have happened without the policy. So the difference between that policy off scenario and reality, the policy on scenario, is the impact of the conservation action. And clearly this is also the case in other applied disciplines, in medicine, in engineering, in education indeed. So you can see that in this particular scenario, the conservation policy in question, even though some deteriorations have occurred, has still been delivering an overall positive impact. The situation with the action is much less bad than it would have been without the action. Let's have a look at applying these kind of counterfactual techniques for assessment of genuine conservation impact. Let's have a look at applying these sorts of techniques to some of the data sets and some of the situations that we've looked at in the first half of the talk. I'll start here by looking at the genuine impact of conservation on species extinction risk globally across all species of birds, mammals, and amphibians around the world over the last 3 decades. This was work led by Mike Hoffman, now from the Zoological Society of London, and published in 2010 at the time of the establishment of the ACHI targets and the strategic plan for biodiversity. So first of all, here's the red list index. This is basically the same graph that you've seen earlier in the talk, showing deteriorations across different taxonomic groups, across mammals, across birds, across amphibians around the world over recent decades. Deteriorations, increases in extinction risk. What Mike and colleagues did was to say, what happens if we subtract the genuine positive changes from across that entire data set? What happens if we take out those species which have had positive changes in extinction risk, for which extinction risk has been reduced? Species like those which I mentioned earlier in Mauritius and the Seychelles and Fiji, where actions like invasive species control and protected area establishment have successfully increased their probability of survival, decreased their extinction risk. If we do that, what we see is that for birds and mammals at least, the policy off scenario, that red line, is substantially worse than what has actually occurred. About 20% difference for birds and for mammals between what has happened over recent decades and the worst deteriorations which would have happened in the absence of conservation action. So for birds and mammals, at least, a positive story emerging here. Conservation has been making a difference in reducing extinction risk over recent decades. The story is still less pretty for amphibians. For amphibians, deteriorations have been continuing at the same pace that they would have been doing in the absence of conservation. So much more effort still needed in amphibian conservation. There's some follow-up work also from Mike Hoffman a bit more recently, looking more comprehensively at all of the world's species of carnivores and of ungulates, species like this Javan rhinoceros, and asking not just what happens if you remove those species for which there have been positive changes over recent decades, but asking specialists in each of those species, in each of those species groups, to estimate, to model what would have happened to their extinction risk over the last 25 years or so in the absence of conservation action. Again, the gray bar at the top there shows the policy on scenario, the observed red list index. And yes, that shows deteriorations. It shows increasing extinction risk over the last 25 years or so. But the policy off scenario is much, much worse, actually 10 times worse in this situation for large-bodied mammals, species threatened by a whole cocktail of threats, hunting, overexploitation, trade, as well as habitat loss. You can see here that there's a wide range of uncertainty. The dashed line there shows an optimistic scenario, and the long dashes at the bottom show a pessimistic one. But even the most optimistic scenario is still much worse than what has actually happened. So again, for the world's carnivore and ungulate species, a positive impact of conservation actions over recent decades. And Javan rhinoceros exemplifies this picture very well. It's a species which historically was widespread across Asia. It's become extinct in mainland Asia, extinct in Vietnam just in 15 years ago. Survives in Ujung Kulon National Park, only in Ujung Kulon National Park in West Java in Indonesia. If it were not for that national park, there is no question whatsoever that the species would be globally extinct. So again, it's not perfect, but it's showing us that locally, where conservation is implemented, it can have positive impacts. Here's some more recent work published just a couple of years ago. This work led by Frederica Bolam from University of Newcastle. And what she did was to look across all bird and mammal species and use a Delphi technique, a systematic technique for harnessing expert elicitation, expert opinions, to ask which species would likely have become extinct over the last 30 years in the absence of conservation action. What Rika and colleagues were able to show was that there are at least 30 species, maybe as many as 50 species of birds and mammals around the world, which have a high probability to have gone extinct over recent decades if conservation actions were not being carried out. And this graph shows the dark blue colors on the left-hand side for birds on the left and mammals on the right, show species for which there was actually a low probability of extinction in the absence of conservation actions. Those on the right-hand side in the bright green and yellow colors are those species which would very likely have been lost in the absence of conservation actions. What that translates to is a reduction in overall species extinction rate of between 3 and 4 times across all bird and mammal species. So a dramatic reduction in actual extinctions, the most fundamental manifestation of biodiversity loss over the last 30 years, thanks to conservation action. A really strong success. It's not 100% success. There have still been extinctions. Over the last 30 years, 15 bird and mammal species have become globally extinct. So we haven't scored 100% as humanity by a long way. But nevertheless, we've shown that it's possible. We've shown that it's possible to prevent extinctions, to turn around the curve, to reduce the wave of species extinctions. And this kind of approach can now be applied not just retrospectively, the kind of figure on the left-hand side there of measuring conservation legacy or conservation impact, but also prospectively to develop scenarios that ask what may happen over future years if conservation is stopped. So that tells us about conservation dependence that may happen over future years if conservation is increased within plausible bounds, and what may happen in terms of potential for recovery of individual species over the long term. These kind of scenarios, counterfactual scenario approaches, both looking backwards and now looking forwards, are being put into practice now as the green status of species approach. Let's shift over. We talked earlier not just about species, but also about places, about protected areas, about measuring the conservation success of approaches to safeguard important areas of land and water. This is some work led by Stuart Butchart from BirdLife International to put together the data from the Red List of Threatened Species, from Protected Planet, from the World Database on Protected Areas, and from the World Database on key biodiversity areas, to ask how important protected area coverage of species ranges is to reducing the Red List Index, reducing the extinction risk of particular species. So looking across species which are well protected, species for which more than half of the important sites, more than half of the key biodiversity areas in which they occur are protected areas, Butchart and colleagues showed that there have been deteriorations, that the Red List Index for those species has been declining over recent years. But then they looked at those species for which protected area coverage is poor, for which less than half of the important sites for those species are covered by protected areas. And they showed that for those species, deteriorations, the slide of those species towards extinction, has been twice as fast as for those species which are well safeguarded in protected areas. So protected area coverage, this is one of the strongest empirical demonstrations of the genuine impact of protected areas around the world. Protected areas have been slowing the rate at which species are sliding towards extinction by about 50%. Again, it's not a perfect score. We're a long way from delivering comprehensive conservation success, but it's much better than what would have happened in the absence of those protected areas. Last slide. Let me take you back to wrap up to the Philippines. Take you back to Cebu. Now, the story isn't over. The story is still being written. Cebu flowerpecker remains extremely rare. It hasn't actually been seen at all for the last couple of years. And so the future of the species, the future of the biodiversity of Cebu, the future of the biodiversity of our planet still hangs in the balance. But there are very positive signals, drawing from the fact that locally, drawing from the fact that where it is implemented, conservation delivers positive impacts. Over the last couple of decades, a new organization developed specifically, a local Cebuano organization developed specifically to focus on the conservation of the Cebu flowerpecker and the other endemic species of Cebu, has been working to, in particular, to undertake reforestation with native species around those tiny patches of habitat, working with local communities who need those forests. As I said, Cebu is a very dry island. The importance of the forest in protecting their watersheds is fundamentally important. The importance in providing fuel wood and pole wood for building is fundamentally important. And the importance of that forest for retaining, for allowing the survival of their species, of the Cebu flowerpecker and other species, is incredibly important. And so that is an effort, that's a conservation effort, which is being led by the people of Cebu, being led by the Philippines Biodiversity Conservation Foundation towards safeguard of the species, the ecosystem only found on their island. Overall, conservation does work. We just need much more of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Abrimos ahorita un espacio para preguntas. Nuestra colega Priscila tiene micrófono acá, es un micrófono de diadema, pero vamos a tener que utilizarlo así. En caso de que alguien tenga alguna pregunta para dirigir a Tom, nada más que nos levanten la mano para que Priscila pueda apoyarles. Entonces, gracias.
Gracias. Sobre Gracias, Tom. I'll do the question in English then, okay? On the graph that you showed, there has been positive impact on the birds, on the mammals, but then amphibians, right? Is there a short answer or is there light after the tunnel on what we can do?
Thank you for the question. So why is amphibian conservation struggling in particular? So there's not a single answer, but there is a combination of answers, and it relates to the threats. It relates to the drivers of deteriorations of amphibian extinction risk, deteriorations of probability of survival in the first place. And the issue for amphibians is that the range of threats is more diverse and more complicated than it is for birds and for mammals overall at the level of the entire group. Many amphibians are threatened by loss of habitat, as with birds and as with mammals. And for those, the kinds of solutions, incentives to reduce habitat loss, protected areas are more straightforward. Amphibians are also threatened by unsustainable harvest, especially in Asia. That's harder to address, but there are solutions. But maybe most challenging and most important in answering your question, amphibians are also threatened by disease, by a fungal disease, chytridiomycosis, which doesn't have a diagnosed cure. We don't have any solutions for it. We can cure it in the lab. We can cure it ex situ. And in fact, work in Costa Rica, I think, has been particularly important in looking for solutions there. But in the wild, we don't have solutions. It's early days. The amphibian assessments are also more recent, and so there's been less time since the declines have been diagnosed, and so there may also be an issue of time needed to put in place conservation actions. Conservation actions for birds and mammals date back much longer, date back many more decades. But complexity of threats is the core to the answer to your question. And I think there was maybe a follow-up question on the same lines here.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I have a particular question that is related to the previous question. Usually international organizations and groups like NGOs, they're focused usually on species number. That's always been kind of a problem in the tropics, where we still haven't decided how many species we have. And the change of focus into conserving or preserving specific areas or key areas is a much broader approach where we're preserving not only species number, but also interactions. My specific question is related to the amphibians, but I'm talking about habitats per se, where we already have habitats that are preserved. For example, mangroves, highland areas, for example, in the tropics are always preserved. But they are threatened beyond that preservation threat. They're threatened by climate change, sea level rise. So we're always going to have a background extinction on those areas, although they're still protected. And that creates somewhat of a problem because we're always going to have a declining line in the red list, although they're already preserved. And that will create either a focus, an idea to change the focus and to just leave those areas be and wait for species turnover to come on and then they just transform to something else, or we literally lose all attention on them, and that worries me. I particularly work in tropical highlands that are being threatened by climate change, temperature rise, etc. And they're always protected. At least in Costa Rica, anything above 2,200 meters is protected by law, but we still have a background extinction that is it's unavoidable by a larger scheme of things, which is climate change, which is not something we can change with simple area preservation. So my question is, what would be IUCN focus on these sort of areas? Thank you. I hope I'm going to say my clear.
Great question. So first of all, to me, but also to the world, because it's embedded within the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, within the Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goal number 15. We have an obligation, a moral obligation, an environmental obligation to halt human-induced, to halt anthropogenic loss of biodiversity, to halt extinctions which are driven by humanity. Yes, extinction is part of evolution, extinction's a natural process, but the background rate of extinction over Earth's history is perhaps 1,000 times lower than that currently underway as a result of human activities. So to me, what that means is we need to plan and to implement conservation actions based on what is needed. And there won't be a one-size-fits-all answer to that. It will mean different kinds of actions in different places. And actually, the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is really nicely structured in that way, to have this set of 23 targets, in particular 8 of those targets that are focused on abating different kinds of threats, invasive species and diseases for those amphibians, habitat loss and protected areas, sustainable use, pollution, the same kind of a set of different threat abatement actions that I showed in the Langhammer et al. Work. That includes climate change adaptation. So I guess the only point in your or climate change response, the only point in your intervention with which I would disagree a little is on the inevitability of climate change impacts. To me, we have an obligation through the Paris Agreement, through Sustainable Development Goal 13, to tackle climate change, both through mitigation to reduce the extent of climate change and through adaptation to reduce its impacts. And so I wouldn't write off species in those places which are threatened by sea level rise or by ocean acidification or climate change in different ways, but rather work simultaneously on the range of responses, adaptation, mitigation, pollution control, whatever it may be, that are required for the particular case, the particular place, the particular species in question. Thanks. Please.
I want to know, what do you think about the new creation of OMEX? And if, yeah, sorry, we say OMEX in Costa Rica. and if this strategy are the best in the long term to continue with positive results in conservation?
Thank you for the wonderful question. So first of all, you've taught me a new acronym, OMEX. I learn a new thing every day. So this is the idea of safeguarding important places, not just through protected areas of land or water which are dedicated to conservation management, but also through what are now being called other effective area-based conservation measures, OMEX. Areas of land or water which are not primarily dedicated to conservation management, but which nevertheless deliver effective conservation impacts. And that, if you think about it, that definition is a really exciting, a really powerful one. It's actually setting OMEX to a higher bar than we set for protected areas. For protected areas, we're asking that they are managed for conservation, but we're not asking them to be effective. We're not requiring them to be effective. Whereas OMEX, we're building into the definition that keyword effective. We're saying they need to be effective. So there's a wide range of possibilities of what such places could be that are managed for other purposes, first and foremost, but nevertheless delivering effective benefits for the biodiversity that live within them. That could be areas of private land or indigenous territories or local communities. It could be private, it could be other branches of government. It could be the military. It could be forest reserves or fisheries concessions. But with the requirement that the way in which those places are managed, while not primarily for conservation, is still delivering conservation benefits. And to me, if we can actually get to the point of genuinely measuring and ensuring that those OMEX are indeed delivering effectively, that is actually the answer to all of our concerns here. That is giving effective conservation by definition. There is a danger, and the danger is that it is potentially quite easy to game. It's potentially quite easy for, let's say commercial interests or so to claim that the way that they're managing a given place is effective when in fact it's not. And so robust indicators, robust monitoring, the kind of work which I hope I've demonstrated here is going to be really important for making sure that the E, the effective in OMEX, is indeed a genuine effectiveness. Thanks.
Bueno, creo que con esto concluimos nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas. A continuación, nada más queremos hacer un reconocimiento a la Escuela de Biología y a la Escuela de Geografía por habernos permitido tener esta actividad aquí en sus instalaciones, el apoyo que nos han brindado, y entonces nuestra directora regional va a hacer entrega de unos obsequios que tenemos para ambos. Pues muchas gracias. Están allá. Muchas gracias. Entonces ahora los invitamos a compartir un ratito con nosotros acá. Al equipo de UICN les pedimos por favor un momentito para una fotografía acá interna que tenemos que hacer y después pasamos a disfrutar con nuestros invitados y los que nos acompañan esta tarde. Muchísimas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Gracias.